Hi, everybody. So my name is Leen Besien, and I'm coming from the law school. This is one of my few times on main campus. It's really nice here. I wish I'd come here more. But basically, I wrote this, I did a paper for a class I took last semester on state and local law, and I just zoomed in on the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit, also known as the BART. And just to jump right in. A lot of headlines coming out from the Bay Area about the BART going broke. We all know that like all the public transit systems when COVID first hit suffered tremendously. Everyone starts working from home and everyone's also scared of crowds. Like public transit just took a huge hit. And the BART has been struggling to recover. And, so here's some headlines. I saw another one that was like, what to do when the transit system is dying. So it's all very grim. And I was curious, what is it about the BART that is making it struggle so much? And what can we learn from this about how the financing was set up? Why is it running out of money? So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I think mostly going to talk about what I learned about like the three different levels of where the BART is getting its money. And then I think a lot of people here will probably understand my plea to say no service cuts, but we're going to talk a little bit about why. And then some ideas on like, what's the problem here and what are some levers of change? So here's a nice lovely map of the Bay Area rapid transit system. And just to give a little history. So the Bay Area Rapid Transit District was first created by a California legislator state statute in 1957. And the way it works is that the state government said, okay, here, you 5 counties, we give you permission to raise taxes to like build this and fund this. And actually pretty quickly, 2 of the counties were like, no, thank you. That sounds expensive. Have fun. So the Bay Area, the BART actually is mostly in 3 counties. That includes San Francisco County, which is on this peninsula. And then across the bay, it's in Contra Costa County and in Alameda County. Both of those are East Bay counties. And from the get-go, like there was a vote. So the state statute authorized voters to approve additional property taxes. And California actually has very strict like restrictions on property taxes. So this is one way that you can actually increase your property taxes is to finance bonds for public transit infrastructure. And they did this first in 1962 to like actually build the system. And since then they've done it twice more, once in 2004. And that was to increase earthquake resiliency. And then again in 2016 to just improve the aging infrastructure. So that's the capital side of things. On the operational side of things, this district also has the authority to impose sales taxes. And so there's like a 0.5-cent sales tax in all the 3 counties of the BART, and that most of it goes to the BART system itself. The BART actually is almost before the pandemic was kind of held as like a golden standard of like, wow, this is how like a transit system can actually rely on so little like greater aid. It actually took in a lot of operating revenue. The majority of its expenses historically were covered by passenger fares, but then also but also like things like parking fees for parking lot outside of all these outside of their stations. So that's on the local side. On the state side, what is available from California? So there's 2 major systems in California that are available to provide funding to local transit authorities. One is a county-based system, local transportation funds. And the way that works is that California collects a 1/4-cent sales tax across the whole state and then distributes that back out through the counties. So remember the Bay Area, the BART actually is 3 different counties, 3 different core counties. So it doesn't receive this directly. The counties then themselves kind of have to distribute this money to whatever transit systems. Then there's another structure called the State Transit Assistance Fund, and that is funded by a fuel tax. And that has also a kind of complicated formula where it is distributed by population and then also to transit agencies depending on their previous year's operational revenues. And so I have here a graphic from just like comparing the BART versus like average. This is from a report on the top 50 transit systems in the United States. And you can see the state funds are the gray section and on the left is the BART. And so you can see the gray section is only like 5%. versus nationwide on average is 25%. So the BART was set up to be like, look, we don't need California. We're good. We'll do our own thing. And that's not working out so hot right now. So in November 2023, because they have such a big operating deficit, they got a 352 one-time bailout from California, and that's going to hopefully intended to get them another 2 years. So then what's available on the federal side? Like there's a lot of different ways that Congress can distribute funds to transit systems, but the two big ones is there's the Highway Trust Fund, and that is money that is set aside and allocated. It's funded mostly by fuel taxes. And since 1980, they've actually had a separate account they call the mass transit account, and that gets 20% of the fuel taxes. And they use that to do kind of one-off discretionary grants. And these are also mostly capital infrastructure. They don't, like the Highway Trust Fund has not had as much money as Congress has wanted to authorize. So routinely, like in the last few years, Congress has just actually transferred more and more money from like, a one-time basis, but recurring from the General Treasury to the Highway Trust Fund. The other major source of assistance is the Urbanized Area Formula Grant Program. And this is a statutory formula where they take into factors of, where they say population size, density, miles traveled by different passengers, miles traveled by different vehicles, and they use that to calculate how much money goes to different transit agencies. And it used to cover operational expenses, but since 1990, I have a typo there. I apologize. Not $100,000. It's, I think it's 200,000 people. So limited to capital expenses in 1998 for areas with more than 200,000 people. So you can see these two major things are limited right now to capital expenditures. And then after the pandemic, COVID emergency funding, 3 rounds of funding, the CARES Act, the Appropriations Act for 2021, which was passed in 2020, and then the American Rescue Plan gave 30 billion, 14 billion, and 26.6 billion. And they actually, what they did in reaction to COVID is they took the formulas for the urbanized area formula grants, and they just removed that restriction on capital expenditures. They said, hey, use this for operational. It's an emergency, go for it. So what has actually been happening here? So you can see, this is a graph from BART's, like their ridership numbers, and you can see that huge plunge in the COVID pandemic, and it's like slow recovery. And so because it relied so heavily on ridership fares, it was relying on for its operating expenses really on passenger fares. The fact that only 43% recovery is really, really making it hard. And that is, worse than the nationwide average. The nationwide average is 75%. And it's even 61% for like the San Francisco Muni system, which is literally in the same place. So the BART is struggling exceptionally. I mean, the reasons for this are hard to know for certain, but San Francisco, the Bay Area is the Silicon Valley. Hybrid work has been much easier to transition to for the technology sector. And the BART specifically, you can see here, even before the COVID pandemic, it was experiencing a little bit of a dip in numbers and in ridership numbers. And what happened was their workday commuting numbers were actually fine and increasing steadily, but their weekend numbers were like really going down. So, and that's, I was reading one paper which was suggesting that that's probably because the weekend commuting, the weekend travel was probably being taken over by a lot of rideshare programs, Uber and Lyft, very easy to get around. So BART was going all in on commuting. And so that large share of commuting passengers contributed to the fact that COVID hit really hard. And so so the big shift over the pandemic time has been, okay, local funding has been fine. Then federal aid jumped in immediately in 2020, 2021, and now they're going to be relying on state funding for the next 2 years. But what comes next, it's unclear. So just to go quick thought, go through like why service cuts would be bad. So I think a natural reaction would be, hey, people are riding the BART less. Why don't we just cut? Wouldn't that even be better for the climate? Because that's just fewer people moving around. And indeed, it might be like an intuitive thought to say, hey, like if people are working from home, maybe they have a less of a carbon footprint because they're literally just staying in place. And that is one thing, but it's more complicated than that because even if you have more people working hybrid, like the climate impact of the shift to remote work and hybrid work is yet to be determined because as we have more and more remote work, we have more and more people moving further away from cities. Cities themselves can be very energy efficient. And so it's not a simple answer of like, oh, remote work, yay, we're better. And in San Francisco specifically, the alternative private commute across between the East Bay and San Francisco is the Bay Bridge. And traffic along the Bay Bridge has been recovering much more quickly than the BART. So it's not just people staying at home. People are coming back into the city a little bit faster by private transportation than public. So there was room. So by keeping BART service up, there's room for us to still kind of have that climate impact. In terms of equity, like many public transit systems in the world, public transportation is relied on heavily by people of lower income, by people of color. And so, for example, in San Francisco, I think 3/4 of people who make more than $100,000 own a car. So when you start cutting the service and you start cutting things, like people who own cars and have alternatives are less impacted than people who frankly don't. So it's not just, public transportation is not just, a neutral benefit that we like expand and contract depending on how much need it is. It impacts people differently. And it has, net community goods. And then as far as like overall revenues, if we cut service, if we make service cuts, it won't necessarily help the budget, the balanced budget so like completely because ridership numbers are actually heavily impacted by the service frequency. So if you cut service, you cut passengers even more. And then and the costs of public transit are not only the operational cost of running your trains, it's also the maintenance of, and those are fixed costs, which will not be helped by cutting services. So overall, funding is needed. How can we fix this? And just two thoughts to really just that I came on. So I kind of highlighted the structure of the funding at these 3 different levels before. And two things that I noticed. One is that both state and federal side, there's this idea that we're going to put the transportation funding in a separate little bucket. We're going to put fuel taxes towards it. We're going to fund it with this particular sales tax. And the thing is, those sources get hit in economic downturns just like any other sources. And it's when these economic downturns happen that often people need access to public transportation. So it's not like an uncontested truth that transportation funding needs to be a separate source of funding. In other countries, for example, in Germany, it's not just, it's just part of the normal budget. Yes, you still have fuel taxes, but it's not like a dividing line. And so that seems like an arbitrary divide, which I think we can question. And the other thing is this, I think, an arbitrary divide between capital and operational expenses. We've seen, especially on the federal level, the federal government seems reluctant for large cities to provide operational funding. And, there might be some sympathy for the idea that people from cities should pay for their own public transportation. But as we've seen, cities are able to raise their own capital expenditures through things like bonds, through property taxes, and because of the because of the actual benefit to the public good from these public transit systems, I don't think that this arbitrary divide between capital and operational expenses is something we need to take unquestioningly. So those are my short little observations from a short little seminar paper.
Thank you, Leen. Of course, with public transit, equity is a huge piece of it. And Neha, all the way from Georgetown University in Qatar, is going to talk about the gender component and connection between public transit and women empowerment.
really, really deeply appreciative of you making it.
Thanks so much. I had the opportunity to come here from another program that I was a part of, so otherwise it would have been online. And I was actually, I'm actually quite nervous because all of your researches are very well formed. I don't know where Diana, I think she left. I want to be Diana when I grow up because she did so much of regression analysis that I'm scared now. Um, so, okay. So my research on the path to empowerment, investigating the connections between public transit and women's labor force participation, it was sparked last semester when I was taking a class on gender and economic development with Professor Lamis. And there we explored a lot of challenges hindering women's economic empowerment, one of them being the infrastructure and technology gap. Where we highlighted that the crucial role of reliable transportation, like the very important role of reliable transportation in enabling as well as like facilitating women's engagement in modern economic activities. The previous presentation talked about like the effect of cutting funding or like additional funding and like funding allocations in these modern transit projects. However, it's a different discourse for the developing world, and that is where I am concerned with. The point of my research, just so none of you judge me for my incomplete research, was that my professor was trying to teach me on how to estimate models, how to do regression analysis, and how to like identify variables, error terms, dummy variables. And the best way she thought was to make me replicate a lot of data that is out there about public transit systems. And my research focus is in theorizing global South intervention initiatives, especially regarding women's empowerment, which is why we chose women's labor force participation when we were talking about hurdles that women face. So here, the research also highlighted opportunity costs of not focusing on a gender component during thinking about public transit projects, because especially in the developing world, a gender component is sometimes almost taken as a bother, like a luxury that we can't, oh, you should be grateful we are giving you a bus. One of these examples is like when Nepal instilled a lot of skill-based training projects in the capital. The target audience that they were targeting, the women from like outskirts of the valley, they weren't coming in. And when it was analyzed on why it wasn't happening, it was because they didn't have a reliable system to come into the project in time, and as well as like go back home in time. And this talks like there is ongoing conversation about how women women have to face time poverty, and then time poverty while they're handling household works, as well as going out into the community and then earning, as well as learning skills to empower themselves. So here, there are some transport in the figure shows how transport investments can contribute to like a lot of drivers of women's economic empowerment. And then like the conversation around here is also focused on gender and travel behaviors, because a lot of public transit projects also do not consider gender-based travel behaviors. Like, for example, women frequently report that they feel unsafe. They frequently report having to take care of someone while traveling in public transportation systems. So what does that mean for women when they're already having to like take a step, the step to like their own empowerment, as well as an added burden of like, considering all these other factors. So what does it mean on the impact for labor force participation? Of course, there's already the unequal labor force participation between men and women. And when transit projects aren't, especially in the developing world, aren't focused on these gendered aspects, it further exacerbates the cost. It further adds on to the substitution cost of like women not going to work, because it's just adding on more and not being like it's not being compensated from for the work that they're leaving behind. And so this is why public transit accessibility plays a crucial role in women's economic engagement and empowerment. And accessible public transit enables women to access job opportunities, to access markets, to access essential services, whether it be like helplines or other avenues. So I briefly talked about the opportunity cost in ignoring this gender, avoiding the gender component in transportation. The goal, again, of all these analysis is to like avoid past mistakes and then not to have a poor value for money, because especially developing countries in the global south, a lot of funding has been streamlined into bettering these projects. But if there's like poor value for money, if the crucial point is not being addressed, then it doesn't. So the general literature review talks about gender issues and transportation in developing countries that shows like women's perception, whether it be in accessing and using public transportation, mainly concerns around safety issues. Then there are behavioral patterns of how women are more likely to forego better job chances that are maybe like further away from home or that takes more time to go to. And then girls may drop out of school due to a higher transportation time. A better way to put that would be girls are more likely, or like women are more likely to forego better job opportunities or forego education. And then this limited mobility is what then tends to restrict women's economic activities and then curtail their status further behind, whereas other women in their similar socioeconomic background are being able to access certain services. Then so we've also, the past literature also talks about strategies and best practices to improve this access. And most of the literature highlights it as like the real accessibility to programs. Certain programs such as good lighting, as simple as good lighting in bus stops, frequent at request stops, stuff like this. Public awareness campaigns, public education, these are certain best practices that have been highlighted, but even these have been taken as luxurious in most new transit projects in the developing world. And then there are other several non-casual analyzed impacts of these urban transit projects on like access to employment opportunities. And it is true for both men and women. However, studies have shown that women face a higher marginal benefit to a better public transit system. So the case I chose was the case my professor gave me to replicate, let's say that, was Lima's urban transportation, because there is a massively available public data here. So Lima, the capital of Peru, it's like one of the biggest growing areas in Latin America. And she wanted me to analyze this because Lima is also ranked the fourth highest in the reported cases of sexual harassment in public transportation, pre-introduction to this program. So 78% of women actually reported to being sexually harassed or violated introduction of this intervention. And over the past 20 years, past 2 decades, Lima has been transforming its transport systems. And then key projects include the implementation of the bus rapid transit and the Metro Line 1, which is the first metro line in these connected areas. by the way. And by 2014, this was fully operational, and the demand reached as much as an average of 700,000 daily validations by 2015. So the hypothesis, before I haven't done the regression analysis, I haven't used the data right now. I'm building the model right now. So the hypothesis is that improved access and safety of public transportation system leads to increased job accessibility. As simple as that. Seems simple to analyze. However, there is always the case of overestimation and underestimation in these kinds of predictions, especially when we are using like models that are already being used in the global north, or like the countries that already have a developed system of public transit, and then trying to imply it onto the global south, or like countries with newer transit projects. So like I haven't done this again, but the approach that by the way, I'm also taking econometrics this semester only. So the approach that we've been exploring is the diff-in-depth approach, and then try to estimate the impact of this introduction of the BRT line and BRT system and the Metro Line 1 pre and post intervention, and using buffer zones, using zones that are the treatment areas versus the control areas. The treatment areas being areas that are more closer to the bus stations or the metro stations, and then the control areas being like areas that are further away than people are willing to walk to any of these stations to travel. So a sample of the regression model that we've been trying to build on, which is not complete yet because we are yet to add dummy variables that considers for the female labor force in an aspect that there is like single parents, there is age difference. So there are still a little more dummy variables that we need to add and certain extent we need to account for. But yeah, so that's that. The dependent variable here that we're trying to estimate, however, is like this categorical variable that's like reflecting the respondents' employment status in respect to the changes that have been made. So after Lima, my professor and I also have planned to replicate the same model into Vietnam's Orange buses, which is Vietnam's gender action plan for its Ho Chi Minh City, and where Orange for to stand against gender-based violence, and then it can also be done with Pakistan's pink buses, where like the bus driver is the only one who would be in the bus. And this Pakistan's pink buses system is actually a very good example of this, because this was introduced to address the problem that certain skill-based trainings were just not receiving its like target audience. It was just empty. There was like funding coming in, and it was just empty. So there's that. So yeah, so the discussion is still relevant. Like while we're discussing like how funding, discussing the various funding sources for developed countries, and like even to an extent of whether we should cut back on public transportation systems, given like people are working from home and like people aren't even going to the office. Like, is anyone even using it? But the conversation is very different and still relevant for developing countries. And think like the big idea here is to think about transportation as a means of unlocking women's economic potential, because there are still places like I'm from Nepal, and there are still places like it's not accessible by road. The place I lived in was like 2 hours away from my school. So from doing like the bare minimum to empowerment to actual transformation. Thank you.
You, Neha, and Leen. I think Professor Laura King has just arrived. So let's welcome her. But yeah, we'll move on to questions now before we get to a break.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for these presentations, Leen and Neha. I think I wanted to ask what you ended with, Neha, about how you would put in the model that perhaps the jobs are not going to need to be in person, that they might be more hybrid, they potentially might allow people to work from home. So if there is some variation across, maybe particular industries, I just wanted to sort of note, yeah, how you might accommodate that in your future regressions that you're doing. And for Lee, my question for you, um, I heard the financial lens, and I know you're a BU law student. I wanted to hear the legal framing or lens that might be relevant to this question about how a city or a county could refuse, funding for a public good. And so thinking about, how that funding happened for COVID, the sort of initial refusal, funding brought in because of COVID, like how do we then use perhaps maybe a legal frame to ensure that cuts aren't made because this is a public good? So I just wanted to hear some of those legal chops.
Thank you for your question. So again, we're trying to introduce zero variate dummy variables here, where that is, let's say if someone's unemployed and it was wanting to stay unemployed, at least in the formal employment sense, the variable then would account for zero. So like it wouldn't capture the interest coefficient in the regression model. However, since I'm trying to estimate these models for the global south, this is far from the question still, especially for the skill development programs that have been in target for like the audience of women that these programs are trying to reach. So that is still a little further away from the question, but yeah, there are.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you're saying about what are the legal like chops that you could have for these like for local governments. And I guess like thinking about like what the source of funding is, like the local governments only are allowed to like tax sales tax because the state said, like the state passed legislation saying this district is allowed to create taxes and create, poverty. And so, so the district's allowed to, like, the BART is allowed to raise taxes, allowed to raise passenger fares, but right now, I guess with it's just not in a place where it has access to enough funding on its own within its like statutory authority that it has a viable financial model. So that's why it's turning to federal aid, and that's why it's turning to state aid. And yeah, I guess right now I don't I think I'm not convinced that it's worth pushing for like entirely independent local transport, because that puts just the onus so much on local residents and on local communities to bear the burden. But if it is, which I think it is, like a positive good to have people living in cities which are more climate, like lower carbon footprint per person, then as a nation, as a country, I think that it's worth passing legislation allowing federal funds from the general treasury to be used for operational expenses in cities around the country. Now, whether that's politically possible, like, I didn't get into that, but I don't know if I really answered your question, but those are my thoughts.
Just wanted to make an observation, and then I want to hand it over to him. Transit systems are such a concrete example. Same time, and I think these two presentations are really good. All right. So it's a wonderfully concrete example, and the second presentation is also just a wonderful introduction into it's wonderful to put this public get into a big city, which is the full sociological and of the Delhi method. It's super interesting. And so I'm going to hand it over to Ken here because he's actually been very engaged in this issue of trying to establish value frameworks associated with social diet of these people. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Uva. I want to thank you both. I really enjoyed both of your presentations, and these are really important and timely topics. So in my day job, I work for the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and we work with our local jurisdictions across the greater Washington region. And on our transportation planning board includes our largest transit operator, WMATA, who runs Metro Rail, Metro Bus. And their GM came to our board meeting last week to basically describe the fiscal cliff situation that WMATA is facing. So your presentation is really timely, Leen. So the question that I have for you, and I have a question for you, Neha, as well, is with respect to BART, and I'm very familiar with the this topic and the situation that BART and other transit operators across the country are facing, especially in light of the COVID pandemic, is what are some of the strategies that BART is considering to try to mitigate this issue? Like, so for WMATA, they're basically proposing a fare increase. And WMATA's big challenge, which many other transit agencies in the US, most other transit agencies are not facing, is that WMATA doesn't have a dedicated source of funding in terms of sales taxes, which is used to fund like Los Angeles' metro and other, many other cities. So they have to come to the States and ask for dollars. And then another big issue that it's on the minds of the public is that, we have transit operators that are asking for more funds. And then the public perception is that, especially after the pandemic, that, perceptions of crime, increased crime and safety concerns and fare evasion. And that's something that the GM of WMATA mentions, like the number one topic that people raise, and the number one issue is like, what the hell are you doing about fare evasion? Why should we give you more money? So, and I'm pretty sure that's an issue with BART and other transit agencies as well. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I guess one thing I know that was a big, so it's funny, it's so new, it's so actively being worked on right now. Like that state bailout, like it was funny. It was in November 2023. So I'm like writing my research paper. I'm like, oh, cool. Like, let's talk about that. And so I think the BART is pushing for like kind of making that not a one-time thing, like it kind of acknowledging the reality of like we might need more support long term. I know that package did come with like, you must spend some of this money to have better fare gates, because then I think, so it's interesting like how political it is. Like, I don't know how much the fare gate evasion is like, I don't know how the investment in, I was like trying to I didn't get a chance to like really see like how much the investment in like improving will be paid off by actually like stopping fare evasion. But that is just like in the public perception what people want. So as far as like what the BART is doing, I think they can raise taxes, right, if they get a voter for, but I don't think they're there yet. I think right now they're just looking at state aid.
Metro, I mean, they've started installing new fare gates. I mean, New York City is starting to do that. I mean, the question is, yeah, I mean, that costs money too. So, I mean, where does it balance out? And now the question for you, Neha, as well. I think it's really interesting. I love, just the topic of, I think it's a really, really important area of research. I mean, looking specifically at, public transit, and there's been a lot of literature actually. I'm reviewed a lot of the literature looking at, the inequities in public transit services, across gender. And there's been, that's an important topic here in the US and also, from an international context as well. So in terms of, I know you're, still, developing your research, but I was wondering, in addition to, like, I think I recall from your presentation that one of the sources of data that you might look at is a travel survey that was conducted in that region. But whether there's sources of data or information that are you considering, and also in terms of, as you develop your regression models, that I guess what built environment characteristics, social environmental characteristics, perceptions of crime and safety, employment. What are your thoughts on?
For the sources of data, there's definitely the national surveys. But again, with the majority global south countries, national surveys themselves aren't very reliable. So they are then like countered through other check and balance measures. For example, if we're trying to be more localized, because for example, with the pink buses in Pakistan, if we're trying to be more localized, we can see the, what is it called? I forgot the word for it, like the attendance of like the certain programs, like because they're targeted for people in a certain geographical area, for like far away from the city, or like in the suburbs, or women who are like further from the economic centers of the cities. So attendance policies are one of the checks in addition to the national surveys. And others are like just the spending on public transit systems, the spending based on the gender, of course. But then again, the spending is also skewed in terms of women, because like, again, women, they tend to carry a lot of dependents with them when they're traveling, children, old people who are older than them, so they tend to pay for them, or like they receive subsidies from their government. So like that's a little tricky. I'm also trying to figure it out. If you have any suggestions, please let me know. Apart from that, other errors that we've been trying to, like I thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't address that in my presentation, that why is it so important to like build models and not just replicate them like I'm doing, especially in unique contexts, because there are a lot of other variations that we don't account for. Like for women, the choice to use public transit is majority on like security and cost. But then as like the context changes, it also depends on like the cultural factors. There are many countries where like women don't go out without a male accomplice, or like their children. How do we account for that? Is that like what's actually hindering, or like, so that's what I'm trying to do as well, trying to factor in these error terms, as well as factor in like maybe a little more dummy variables, so we can contextualize it as it.
Yeah, no, I certainly understand the challenges. When I was working on my PhD dissertation, like I want, I initially pursued international, comparative international research, and went abroad, and I understand the quality of data issue. And so I had to come back to the States, and my dissertation advisor was like, here's a data set, build some regressions models from it. So that comment really hit home to me.
Thank you. So it's great to learn all of those tools, but for Lima especially, I don't think you're going to get much out of that model. Partly because what you're trying to look at is employment, right? You didn't talk at all about, or like transportation is really important, but most women and most jobs are in the informal sector. You don't have good data about that to even look at that access, right? If you can even figure out how you're going to model accessibility to a job, right? To a formal sector job, which is really hard. And I mean, I work with people that try to model accessibility to these things in the global south most of the time. And so that is sort of a really big thing. And the same thing in terms of this travel surveys, right? Travel surveys, what if, I mean, we usually use origin destination surveys. I would say I fight this every day, are inherently biased against women because of the sampling. I mean, they're looking at the people that are using these systems already, and women aren't using those systems. And so you've got a bias to start with. Women tend to have stops, right? Because they're dropping somebody off at school and picking something up at the store, and going someplace else. So the way that those trips are coded is often very inconsistent, right? Which then makes it hard. So that's sort of on that side. But it's really important to tell these stories and to find ways to do this analysis using all different kinds of methods. And so I'd say use econometrics as much as you can, but think about how it can be supplemented by some other kinds of ways of analysis. And that gets us into some of the issues about budgets, and right, which is sort of something else that's really important. And in terms of sort of as a question, how are other public goods funded in a place like California, where property taxes are severely limited by Prop 13, right? And so you've got these constraints that are much more binding there than I would say in a lot of other places in the US and around the world, although quite closer to don't have to set tax levels at all. They didn't have any of their revenues. So thinking about, I mean, I think that a lot of those transportation funds were set up to ensure that there was money for transportation, right? Yeah. Because it's
I don't know. I have done too much research into that, but I guess one counterpoint of that is on the federal level, they also like created this separate mass transit account. But if you look at actually the levels of funding, so they allocated this in 1980s, and actually the level of money that they started spending declined after that. so I understand the impulse of like wanting to set aside these buckets, but I guess it doesn't feel foolproof enough, and it cuts off, I guess, other general funds. So yeah, that's why. Yeah. Sense to me. And I think I did see something in their like long-term planning documents about like wanting to get like more like dense housing around the stations. Because the part it goes out in Contra Costa County and Alameda County, the stations are not particularly close together. It's very much a system that's designed to bring people from outside the city into the center of the city. And that's and so like by having more dense areas around each station might actually help increase passenger use of like maybe not just going into the city center of San Francisco itself. In terms of like, and I don't know precisely how these funding shortfalls have affected those expensive projects. I'm sorry.
Perfect. Ask me how I could account for certain things like, what if the system is going more towards like work from home, like how and then we you mentioned how like that model would never be able to estimate the actual real changes on ground because there's a lot of informal employment going on. I delved through that as well. That was one of the research gaps I highlighted. I didn't go through it, sorry, but so apparently there's this inverse hyperbolic sign that's like used to account for these zeroed variables. If I'm using the terminology correctly, as in like so when for example, like the example I used earlier, if someone is actually wanting to stay unemployed or like they're not going into like formal forms of employment, then it's just considered like the whole coefficient is considered as zero because like, it's not considered in the regression model. But then that doesn't reflect the so that is why we cannot replicate models. Thank you.